Hello, welcome to the Thermometer. It's at 10 o'clock, so we're a slightly different time from normal. If you're tuning in live, thank you for getting out of bed to watch us specifically. We are about to talk about scenario-based learning. So at the Ding, we try and focus on things that produce outstanding learning experiences. And we've been doing this for quite a while now. And one of the areas that we've focused in on in quite a few of our projects is scenarios. And scenarios, I think when people think of scenarios, they often think of elaborate, complex, multi-camera installations, lots of money and all this kind of thing. And scenario-based learning can absolutely be that, but it also doesn't have to be. And we wanted to talk about this today because there's quite a few reasons why scenario-based learning is increasingly useful in learning design, particularly in terms of how it can unlock some of the skills that are really important in terms of usefulness. So helping people think about how they might use the knowledge they have to solve problems in the workplace, for example, by simulating scenarios. So we think through the work that we've done recently, and if you've tuned into some of our previous webinars, you would have seen us talking about how scenario-based learning can unlock productivity and creativity and the sort of the functioning knowledge and the skills that we think are really useful. But today we wanted to give an insight into some work that we did last week. We had the chance to go to India to work with a university called Watson University, who we partner with, and we had a chance to go into a school and run a scenario. And it's always when you go halfway around the world, you don't really know what to expect. So Phil and I, we had a good chat about how to sort of make sure that this was going to work, make sure this scenario is going to land. So Phil, where did we start with this scenario?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that Tony's absolutely right. Well, first of all, hello everyone, and should say that. And because both Tony and I are experienced course leaders in our own right, I think that means that we have a huge number of war stories where hope meets experience and best intentions go to die. So, I mean, I'm literally haunted all the time whenever I'm going anywhere to do anything for anyone else. I cannot disremember my many experiences of walking into a lecture theatre where I used to do a lot of my teaching, to discover that the projector wouldn't turn on, or to discover that somebody else had been in there, another academic who'd unplugged everything, or that you can no longer get the DVD player to talk to the computer, to talk to the projector. And so you'd have this extraordinary, this beautifully engineered precision idea for a class or for a session. And then you go in and discover that everything was wrong. And then you've got that awful thing where you are adapting in front of learners. And that's fine. I mean, I would say a lot of our muscle memory and a lot of our expertise comes from sort of tap dancing madly while making sure everything's working. But in this instance, because we were, flying 10 hours from Heathrow to Hyderabad, and we didn't know what we were delivering into, we had lots of productive conversations about the bits we could control, the bits we could predict, what we were irreducibly in control of, and what we weren't going to sort of get into. And so in this basic instance, we decided that we would de-tech the entire experience, not because there was any assumption, I want to be very clear, that a highly successful school, international school in India, would somehow be sort of less tech. It was just the fact of, come on, laptops talking to HDMI cables. I've been to so many situations when those moments mean that there's a failure to launch at the very beginning. So we just said, look, come on, learning design and something experiential does not require a laptop. It does not require a projector. Let's start at that level. And this notion of how you might ignite scenario-based learning. How do you produce an imaginative realm in the minds of learners? How can you kickstart a session like that without relying on a PowerPoint presentation, without sort of buying into some of those dependencies? And that's exactly what we did. So I would say that one of the big drivers for this particular session that we're talking about today was born of real pragmatic in the field experience of expecting technology and audiovisual infrastructure to deliver something for you. And I would honestly say that we've got used to that idea. We think that's important. We made it a rule that for us it wouldn't be important in this instance, right?
Absolutely, yes. And prior to being a course leader, as you know, I was a learning technologist, and that was exactly the situation that I was always trying to mitigate for people was walking into a room, things not working. So it's always so much more exciting when you can walk into a room and just get started rather than have to plug things in and worry about it. So yeah, I think that it definitely felt more comfortable to know that we could walk into a completely unknown space and start facilitating straight away. But it did require, I think, to start quite a significant act of empathy. I know we always bang on about empathy in learning design, but really you did a lot of work around this at the start, didn't you? To think about, well, who are these students, who are these kids, who are we going to be working with, where are they, what's the culture, and
Yeah.
what can we reasonably find out? So how did you go about that before we got there?
Well, it's the point about scenario-based learning is that I think you always have to think about people's cognitive budget, right? So I like to think in terms of budget. Again, this is my former course leader talking about, like, yeah, you can have the greatest ideas in the world, but if you're not going to, if the spend isn't working, then it's all going to fall flat. So for me, if you hear me talk about budget, I'm extending that idea to mean like the resource that will make this thing fly or not fly. So when you do scenario-based learning, you're asking a lot already. You're asking that somebody imagines the kind of the infrastructure. There's the sort of storytelling piece, and for a lot of learners, a lot of people, that in itself is often a break with perhaps a traditional classroom vibe or what they're expected to do. So what you can't do is make the imaginative realm so unfamiliar that all of the cognitive budget is kind of spent on landing that scenario. Really, you need the scenario to be so familiar and recognizable that you can move people across that line into imaginative sort of storytelling, fictive realm in a way that is effortless, because what you're then going to do inside that fictive realm, what you're then going to do within scenario, that is where you want them to spend their budget. That's where you want the work to take place. So the short version is that the brief was this. We had a very sort of, primary coloured brief, but the broad idea was that you had school kids who, and this is typical of school kids everywhere, where there is a sort of a sense of merit and achievement and success and velocity all aligned with how well you do in exams or how well you can perhaps recite information, all that stuff around the declarative knowledge that we talked about. If the declarative knowledge is king, because that's how students feel successful, it's how their mums and dads understand the success of their offspring, it's how the school understands its own success in all of those things. When you've got that kind of system, which we see all over the place, it's like, in the knowledge of that, how do you then get people ready for a workplace where, in fact, conscientiousness, obedience, waiting to be right about something, waiting to be told you're right. If a workplace wants all contrary preferences, it wants people to sort of be self-starters, it wants people to have an entrepreneurial mindset, it wants people to deal with imperfect scenarios and blah, blah, blah. So, well, how do you do that? So you've got one kind of like machine that's driving this kind of declarative piece, and then you've got a kind of this other machine, which is kind of the workplace, which is sort of driving other preferences. And so the whole point of the workshop was to ensure that we could produce via scenario the shifting sands of an unpredictable workplace that simulated that tap dancing I was talking about, when you go into a lecture theatre and suddenly discover you've got a room full of students and it's not going your way, but your job is to keep the wheels on. It's like, how do you give that keep the wheels on experience for young people who may find it distressing or may find it kind of confusing because they're being asked to sort of see strength and see learning in instances where it feels like it's going wrong. And so that was kind of our remit, which was like, how can we produce a workshop for young people that produces the turbulence and the headwinds that are typical in a workplace but are not typical in school.
Yeah, it's interesting because I put this slide up because a big theme of the week was this idea of the hidden curriculum. So, like you say, it's if you were to produce a workshop for these students who were trying to figure out what was useful, we started off with this idea of the hidden curriculum, where the vase that you can see is all the disciplinary knowledge. And there was a really interesting activity at the start where we asked the students to decide what they thought was important. Was it knowledge of maths and physics and science and biology, or was it how to be useful in a workplace, or how to be responsive, and how to turn up on time. And there was a really big split in the room, with about 3 or 4 people went towards the disciplinary knowledge, and about 46 kids went towards the stuff around the outside, didn't they? So
that in itself was fascinating, because you never
Mm.
really know how this is going to go. So if you imagine that we put 2 success statements out into the room, to measure how these this demographic would characterize success. And it was interesting because you had the success as it related to exams and sort of subject specific knowledge, and then you had this success statement that was really all around agility, and it was around what we would recognize as these kind of like 21st century attributes, which is sort of the ability to be. And I suppose in a way it wasn't a surprise what happened, because one of those statements was definitely more cooler than the other one. You know, it's a bit like, if you want to be cool, I think there was some social stuff going on there. I suppose it's a bit like, if you want to be the hero of your story, one of those statements felt a little bit more heroic, and that was the one which was interestingly all about confidence and sort of the ability to adapt when things were a bit wonky, when things were sort of like when the wheels were coming off. And I thought that was so interesting, because there was a recognition there of hope and optimism from young people who would also, I think, absolutely in a conversation perhaps with a parent or with a teacher, would have absolutely aligned with the other statement. And I think it's because we rocked up, and we were it was for them, it was a sort of we were a disruption already. So I think in that respect they understood that something was going on. And so yeah, but we knew that the only way to produce those headwinds in a safe way, and as I said, to ensure that these young people weren't spending their cognitive budget on understanding what we wanted, the work that Tony and I did in advance of this workshop was to think about a scenario that would absolutely land with these young people. And so, it's a bit like people think, oh, scenario-based learning, bespoke scenarios, that sounds very complicated. That sounds like a big sort of time sink. How do you do that? This is a classic example of where AI, in terms of helping teachers produce the conditions where they can get in front of students more quickly and get in front of students more productively. This was an absolute example of this, because the long short of it simply was, there's a couple of things that I knew. So one of the interesting things around schools and sort of merit-based structures is that they're quite hierarchical based. It's sort of like, there is a right answer, and there's a professor who knows it, or a teacher who knows it, whatever. But we particularly looked at startups, and the reason why startups are interesting is because startups tend to have a flatter hierarchical structure. In other words, that when you join a startup, it's basically a bit of a free-for-all in terms of like job descriptions, and everyone just had to kind of adapt. And we were in Hyderabad, and Hyderabad has earned the moniker Cyberbad, because it's kind of a place of it's the sort of startup capital. It's where the tech is. And so, just from a scenario-based point of view, it's like, well, okay, that's a sort of a piece of sort of, that's a bit of cultural real estate there that we can use. So we scenarioed the idea that these young people were joining a startup in Hyderabad, and the startup had a particular brief. It was called Festival Fusion, and they were all about reinventing sort of the traditional festivals, and sort of like it was part kind of experience design. It was part sort of like event management. It was all of those things. But the point was that the structure of a startup meant that some of those traditional hierarchies, the sort of the static roles in a team, were at the very beginning designed to fall away and to blend and to sort of intersect and become more sort of like feral and more difficult. And I was able to use kind of AI and able to use sort of my understanding of where we were going in context to sort of ensure that that cognitive budget would be spent in the right way, as opposed to spending, I don't know, 25 minutes of a session going, hello, we're doing scenario-based learning today. And we didn't have to do any of that. And that was an absolute example of getting this right, and sort of aligning it with the audience.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it? It's how do you reduce resistance? Because, like you say, you're taking students that have never met you before from a different culture on a journey, and you're asking them to invest their creativity and their confidence in this thing, and you've got no idea what you're walking into. And so anything that you can do to make that scenario feel more familiar is important. And so you can see this was the first email that students got, which we'll talk about how this played out in a second. But just the idea that there's some familiar names in there in terms of like Banjara Hills, which is where we were going. So that was just down the road from them. And the festival that was talking about was a festival they were familiar with. So even though this is just text on a page, you can see how instantly, in terms of imagination, this will produce some response that is familiar. So it's not like we're going to do a festival in the United Kingdom where they're like, I don't know how that works. This already you're drawing on a lot of cultural capital.
And I think the other thing I want to say here is that we've talked a lot in previous webinars about this notion of the MacGuffin, which we've borrowed from film, but that is, and for some people, it's a challenging idea, which is that the subject's specific, that the subject of your session isn't as important as you think it is. And this is a classic example where what we were interested in doing was producing an experience of shifting surfaces and intersections, and the idea that people dealing with change in a way that felt de-risked to a degree, but also different and disruptive. Now, the thing is that in a way, so we've just said, and it sounds counterfactual or counterintuitive, I'm sure, that we spent a lot of time ensuring that the context for this scenario was absolutely on the money. But the scenario is a MacGuffin. The scenario is just what, the story of that session was giving these young people this really sort of this real immersive experience of dealing with change and conflict. That was what the learning session was about. The scenario, if you like, is a MacGuffin. It's just driving the behaviors where the learning is. So the learning, it looks like the whole session was about a group of young people in a fictional startup seeking to reimagine a particular festival for a particular region. But what Tony and I knew was that really that was just like it's just a plot. The story is what was happening around those tables. The story was about the negotiations, and it was about the energy in the room. And I think that that's such a key distinction about why you put your energies where you do. We ensured that the MacGuffin, that the scenario was absolutely right. So it didn't take up any time. It didn't take up any space, just in a way that in a film, the plot services the story. You don't want your audience worrying about the plot. You want your audiences engaging with the story. And I think this is a classic example of you have to do a lot of craft and graft to make the plot invisible. And that's really what I'm talking about here, that this was about ensuring that the scenario was so on the money and so culturally, the Velcro was there, that it was effectively invisible. And it enabled us to then produce the much more important effects, which were about the learning that was taking place in that room. I don't know if you would just echo that, Tony, or in that sense.
Yeah, I think and the proof of that was borne out by the fact that we had to do very little explaining. So once we introduced ourselves a little bit, and then we said, right, we're going to do an activity. All we had to do was give each table this first email, and then suddenly they were able to get started because the familiarity there, wasn't it?
I mean, in terms of the plot, right? So let's just, now I've introduced the idea of the plot. The plot was simply this, that the session began, they were put into teams. They were the creative development teams for the Festival Fusion startup. And we had a character of the CEO. And the CEO was communicating to these creative development through firing off emails. And so the very first email that came out was, and this is about scaffolding. So the very first email that came out had bullet points, and it asked exactly for what it wanted. In other words, it was like a shopping list, a declarative shopping list. It was like, okay, this is the project. You need to do this. You need to have that. You need to do this. And so, and that went out. And the way we did it was, these were just bits of paper. So each table was given a copy of this email as if it had arrived in their inbox. Now we could have had this very elaborate thing involving smartphones, or like, I don't know. They just thought, no, we're not just going to print these off, because what we're interested in is the effect. We're not in, the scenario doesn't have to kind of be a hologram. It just has to produce a fictive Velcro in the minds of the learners. That's all it had to do. So off this piece of paper went out, and so for 20 minutes, they all got busy. They all got busy, and they all sort of worked their way through. And that's as far as the learners were concerned. That was the shape and size of it. It was like, okay, you've got this job to do, get on with it. So 20 minutes passed, and then that was when we started to have a bit of fun, right?
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing is the fact that the CEO was absent completely. So this is a great example of what we've talked about previously, which is the Kuleshov effect, where imagination is triggered by encountering an object or something that's not there. So you get an email. In the email, it says the CEO's asked you to do this, and suddenly that produces the effect in the learners where they're working for this person. It worked really well, I think, in terms of it didn't, like you say, it didn't require a huge cognitive effort. They could see they were in a startup, they had a team, they had post-its, they had a very clear brief, and they just got started. And it was fantastic walking around the room. There was each table had its own sort of energy, but there was some of them just got so into it in terms of, like, can I get a bonus? I want to rise. I want to complain to the CEO.
Yeah, and then so just when essentially they all felt terribly successful, I think, and perhaps it was like it was a class about doing well. It was a bit like it was all about, right, okay. And then the way we designed it is that we then designed a series of sort of other emails that came out to sort of and this is actually this is the last email. So if you imagine that that the email that followed the very first one was, oh no, there's been an update in the data, and actually there's a demographic that this festival is for. There's been a sort of some new insights, and it now needs to tack towards that, or is and students were like, okay, so there's a big reframe, and then there was another email so that was 20 minutes, and then the whole point, I should say, is that the idea was at the end of the session they would have to then as a team present their sort of proposal, which was sort of meeting this criteria. Like 20 minutes later, there was a classic client email that just asked for more wow factor, like one of those rubbish. And we get these ourselves, where a client has just suddenly, I don't know, had too many coffees and woken up with an idea that they need something else in the mix, or they want something less or more of that or less of this. And so what was happening is that these waves of change were coming through. And of course, one of the other things that we did to sort of produce conflict was about halfway through the session, again, just as bits of paper, we had 5 job descriptions or sort of character traits in terms of team, who the people around the table, the young people, then had to adhere to these roles. So somebody always had to be lobbying for the cultural aspect of the festival. Somebody always had to be lobbying for it to be more digital, and there had to be more apps, and somebody had to be lobbying for a particular generation had to be involved. And so I remember this amazing conversation, sort of like halfway through this this student looked at me and she said, but now this means that we're going to fight. And I just said, well, you might fight, or you might have to sort of like find ways to sort of, to negotiate, or to sort of arrive at sort of a place. So we kept changing the rules all the way around, and though that we were risking, we risked the scenario. And this is I love this photo. This was kind of, I think this was the point. I think this photograph was taken at the point when. So we'd been like driving them towards this 5-minute presentation, and then the last email came in from the CEO. And it's here, and it was basically like, you thought you had 5 minutes to present your proposal, you've got 1, because the CEO's too busy, and his agenda's changed, and the room just went wild, and you're like, oh no. And then sure enough, then Tony was walking around with a timer, so it was like properly sort of, there was a game show vibe, and I think that was absolutely important in driving it along. And there was a thing that happened that was very interesting, which is that Tony and I are always very conscious when you're designing a session. It's like, well, okay, people need a break, or people need to rest, or you need to, there's all sorts of learning design principles around. A session can't go beyond 40 minutes, or that, or there's all that kind of stuff. And then there's what happens. And what happens in this room was that the energy was going up and up and up, and I caught the eye of one of the experienced teachers in there. And to be clear, we were also being facilitated by some brilliant teachers, so who really knew the group and all that kind of stuff. So it's not, we sort of, we didn't ride in on our white steeds and change learning forever. I want to be clear. We were absolutely embedded in, we were helped. It was great. We were helped in all sorts of ways. I want to be very clear about that. But there's one point when Tony and I sort of exchanged glances and sort of looked at the clock. It was like lunchtime was like there. They hadn't had a break. And I looked at one of the teachers and we sort of like, should we break? And she said, no. She said, because you absolutely have them. He said, you have them. You won't get this again. If they go, you absolutely have them. I don't think any of those young people were looking at the clock. I don't think any of them were. They were just worrying about this fictional CEO. They were they were worrying about the next email that was going to come in. I mean, I can honestly say, I mean, I like teaching, but the energy in the room, it was literally like, I live by the seaside, and sometimes you see a seagull riding the thermals, and you think that seagull doesn't have to be riding those thermals; it's just having a great time. And I did feel at some point that we were riding the thermals in that room, and because the energy was electric. I mean, it was okay. You've only got 1 minute. I mean, one of the most charming things I've seen for a long time, and I'm sure you'll agree, Tony, is watching these teams of people carry like enormous numbers of post-it notes up to the stage. And then some young person was given the job of machine gunning their proposal, and you were timing them. And I don't know, the whole thing was a really good example of how hard a scenario can work when that scenario is words on a page. It's a printout, but in that room, the startup existed, really, right? The startup existed. It was great fun.
Yeah, I think that they say we had help. I think firstly the school was brilliant, but I said the other thing that really helped the scenario to land, we had 2 fantastic student volunteers from Oxon, and they didn't know what they were getting themselves into either. And we briefed them in the car, and that they are of Indian origin, and so that really did help, because we said, well, actually, we can really work with you guys if you're up for it, if you're up for coming on a bit of a journey. And once we explained it to them, so we positioned them as the 2 PAs for this fictional CEO. And so whereas we sort of launched the activity, we were then able to hand over to them and just do a little bit of role play and acting. And then when this email come in, one of them would come running in with a bit of paper going, I'm really sorry, we've got an email. And wow, I mean, they absolutely played into the role, didn't they? And I think that just really helped land it.
Oh yeah, and again, it comes back to this idea of where do you want your learners to spend their cognitive budget? What are you asking them to think about before you get to the thinking that you think you're doing? And I do think for a lot of people looking at educational or learning experiences, people don't give enough time to the idea of budget, cognitive budget, because the reason why this worked was, and again, Tony's absolutely right, that because we had these facilitators who could come in, that they could do a lot of, on a keyboard, you have hotkeys. You can sort of have these shortcuts on a key, and I could see them shortcutting all over the place, and that was to do with cultural knowledge, and it was to do with sort of indigenous understanding of like how to sort of get past. There was a brilliant moment where. So Tony and I were walking around with mics, and we were performing, and it was fun and it was silly, and I gave some instructions around the presentation, and one of the facilitators caught my eye, and she suggested that could she take the mic, and I said fine, and then she literally re-gave my instructions in a way that she'd understood that I'd produced word salad. I was producing words, and those words were not landing, or for whatever reason. And she just took them and she just sort of repurposed my words, and then suddenly got the room. And again, I enjoyed the elasticity of watching that happen the whole time. So sometimes I think the fact that it shouldn't be underestimated, that our difference and our sort of strangeness or our otherness, our disruptive power, because we've been invited to come in and break the traditional schedule, that was absolutely going on as well. So the idea of, Tony and I've talked about this before, but maybe never in a webinar. about this notion of snow days, which I know might sound strange considering we were in Hyderabad and it was like 38 degrees or whatever. But one of the things I've always noticed about school and sort of humans is that, when you have the snow day, so when suddenly snow stops play and suddenly dads are out with their kids on a Monday playing and nothing is going on, that there's an energy that comes with a snow day because it is absolutely a disruption to the normal. And I think there was a snow day thing happening, of course, in that room because it was a special thing. So I think people were sort of receptive, but I think they were also cagey. They were cagey. It was like, why are these guys? They've come all this way. What's the point? In fact, one of the young people said to me afterwards, when I saw that we were doing a workshop, I didn't understand what it was about at all because I think the workshop was expressed in words that were about I don't know. We didn't write this copy, to be fair, but it was sort of like, hey, workplace capacities for the 20. I don't know what it was, but as soon as that scenario was in and they were on the starter, it was like it didn't need to be explained. And there's a lot that I watched and learned really, and a lot that was confirmed. But there was something about what you don't need to produce an extraordinary learning experience. I think that was one of the things I thought. There's a whole webinar here on what you don't need and what you think you need. So it was a very great example of what learning looks like when it's actually happening.
Yeah, and again, I'll just show a picture. You have to have the obligatory photo at the end of everyone just to say, hooray, it's a great thing. But they were such a fantastic bunch. But I think it really was a great demonstration of the power of empathy to, like you say, reduce cognitive load, help people get started quickly, and to anticipate how to land something. Because we could have done that in any space. You could have done that outside. I mean, it really was an act of, from a learning design perspective, thinking about what you knew about that space and those people and what you didn't know and what you didn't need. And as you say, there's a lot to be said there around getting rid of the stuff that's going to get in the way of stopping people getting moving quickly. All you need is 4 bits of paper and some post-it notes and a scenario that they can see themselves in. And wow, I mean, I don't think I've seen a room have that many ideas in a long time. I mean, there were post-it notes falling off all over the place, weren't there? But
I mean, just from a some of my highlights were, let's think about it. So as I've said, the point of this was to produce these shifting sands and these headwinds, and to give people an experience of risk in a scaffolded space. And I think Tony and I are doing a lot of thinking about apprenticeships at the moment, and all of these kind of best intentioned these qualifications, these experiences that are all trying to speak to usefulness, they're all trying to sort of do a thing. And the problem, I think, with a lot of them is the fact they haven't really resolved the idea of risk. They are not really thinking about risk because risk is hard and it is hard to manage. And often we're used to de-risking everything. And this was a good example of this was our job. We had to sort of produce risk, but of course everyone always worries about the inclusivity side of it and the diversity side of it, about if you're going to create unpredictability and uncertainty, that there are, I mean, I don't like it very much. I mean, we did another workshop for an AI sort of an app developer, and I could tell, and they were all sort of professionals, but there was an ongoing joke about making them do role play, and I could literally see them terrified at that notion of having to sort of the risk of role play. Tony and I are nothing if not pragmatists. I mean, we just know that some of the whizzo ideas that learning design, some of the best practices that learning design will push and that educators know work are deeply unpopular with actual people. So that is why that cognitive budget thing is so important. It's so important to sort of know that. And this is where I think we talk a lot about the boundaries of best practice. But best practice will only take you so far in terms of actually bringing people to the experience that you want them to have. I think you sort of absolutely need to do the empathy thing, as you were saying, Tony, about You know, why do people resist things that are best practice? You know, why you know, if risk and unpredictability and uncertainty and sort of the growth mindset is so essential, and you know, I can't think of there's not a single list on LinkedIn that doesn't agree with all of those things. If that's true, why do we have to keep talking about it? It's like if everyone believed that, and if everyone was doing that, and if everyone thought that was a whizzo idea, I mean, I think LinkedIn will run out of things to say in terms of education. But it's clear that there's a gap between best practice and risk because people don't want to do it. And if you're in an apprenticeship space, it's hard to give people an experience of things going wrong, because why would you? Because if you're partly learning on the job, the idea that when you go and learn on the job things go wrong, I mean, that would be a sort of a disaster, right? So this workshop was fascinating in that we had the freedom to play with poor practice as an intentional means of delivering valuable learning in scenario.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. Like you mentioned this idea of risk and resistance, and what causes learners to resist learning, which happens all the time. Whether it's
Learners resist learning. I mean,
resist learning, like everyone does, whether you're a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old.
that is a fact. It's
Yeah,
absolute fact. It's like learners should be called something else.
yeah, yeah.
Because learners suggest that they're on the same page as the best practice or as the thing designed for them.
That's right. But I think this is where the scenario is interesting, because whereas learners generally resist learning because we all resist change kind of biologically, actually this is where the scenario in a story absolutely combats that. And whether that's for a group of 12, 13-year-old kids in Hyderabad or a group of 30, 50-year-olds in an apprenticeship. I mean, this idea of people buy into stories. So if you can get a story that lands, you can absolutely pull people through it, and then that story can evolve and progress in complexity, and you can take people on that journey. But that is the classic example of the power of narrative and scenario to take people from a point of resistance to a point of absolute engagement.
And we've talked before a lot, and again, I can't help this because this is my preference. But when I think we've talked before, in fact, we did a whole workshop on it when we went to visit the Open College of the Arts, which is around suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
So, suspension of disbelief is another term which we borrow and use, from sort of film and from fiction. But as we've established, between ourselves, suspension of disbelief is this: if you get that wrong, it doesn't matter how engineered, how precise, how expensive, how well calibrated everything else is. If people resist you, they will cross their arms.
Yeah.
And there will be observers of the learning. They won't step over the threshold. They won't learn. They won't give you anything. And suspension of disbelief in learners, you can't teach me anything. I think most learners are secretly thinking, I already know this. I don't need to know this. You can't teach me. Why are you teaching me? Not another bloody workshop. Not another role play. I think there is such a value in starting with that notion that you have to move people over that threshold. And how do you do that? And I think this was a great example of using that sort of. And again, it was an AI thing, obviously, because we couldn't, from our sort of cultural perspective, get to grips with a cultural context without risk of things like a cultural appropriation, without risk of just sort of like projecting into that space and saying, oh, well, I think this is probably quite Indian, or, oh, I think this is about this. And I was relieved and confident and happy to be able to sort of work with an AI that I could, and I've got particular techniques now to sort of like safeguard my prompts and the way that I'm working with it. But by the end of it, I knew exactly what we weren't the challenges we didn't need to meet, and the challenges we weren't going to be faced with. And certainly when I know you and I, we're both, we're grizzled grown-ups. We've done so much facilitation, and we've built loads of things for loads of people over many years. But you stand up in a room with a microphone, and you've got like 60 people looking at you. You are at risk. You are at risk because you are sort of producing an effect. But I think we did everything that we could to ensure that the risks that we would meet would come from the chemical reactions in the room and not from the projector not working, not from the fact that the scenario was impenetrable, and I think we leveraged our otherness. That was the point. We were brought in to disrupt. And I think that, again, just to return to the snow day factor, that notion of sort of like you can bring your difference to those sorts of scenarios with confidence and with intention from a learning perspective. I don't know if that makes sense, but I really felt strongly enabled to disrupt and use my energy there in the knowledge that the scenario was not costing them any budget in that way.
Yeah, I think, and the other interesting thing there is that I think, as you say, there is an effect where you come in. It's the snow day effect. It's the difference. We were outsiders, and that brought some energy to the room because it was exciting and novel. But I also think that would only have got so far. If we talked to those students for 3 hours,
yeah.
like, your difference doesn't get you that far. So it got us in the door, and it got us. It sort of got us started, and then it was like, and now let's deploy the scenario, and the scenario then that held the energy for 3 hours.
Oh, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And again, Tony, you're in a good position to sort of, this was about facilitation. It wasn't about broadcast. It wasn't transmissive. It was fun. And I think the other thing it's not often talked about, but I think you and I were able to compare. So it's about casting, and we talk a lot about casting, and perhaps this will sound immodest. It's not meant to, but because you and I have both been course leaders, both used to kind of facilitation, that there was probably a lot of going. I mean, I know that one of the Waxon liaison guy, the guy who does a lot of sort of university into schools, he did take me to one side at one point afterwards and said, "I have never seen anything like that happen. I have never seen anything like that." And of course, my answer to that wasn't like, "Oh well, we must Ding must be extraordinary." I mean, we are, but I didn't. My thought was, actually, that's interesting because that's about facilitation. Really, that's about performance. And the other thing that I think was very interesting is that I feel that because of how we're used to delivering, the fact that it's not in the photos, but you and I spent a lot of our time sort of kneeling down around the table, kind of like, looking in the eye, just really engaging, non-bound, no, the hierarchy was not there. I think there was something going on there about not being the subject matter expert and not buying into the role of distance and sort of, professionalism being around hierarchy. And I think that's something too that I've reflected on about professionalism and confidence in a space like that. That I think for a lot of people, if you're a subject matter expert, if you're a professor, if you embody a place of like research, that the way you perhaps perform your expertise is to reproduce hierarchy, or is to reproduce a kind of like elder statesman vibe. And I think we were obviously elder, for obvious reasons. And we were like, but yeah, but the fact that we were sort of in and out and moving around and facilitating, I think again, that it's what confidence looks like. And I think the casting was good, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. So I think it's been good to have a chat about that, because it was such a rewarding experience, not just to sort of see it land in the room, but also just to test our thinking around scenario-based learning, because we don't get huge amounts of opportunities to go and do something like that in a completely different country, in a different context.
We build it for other people, but we don't get
to actually facilitate it ourselves. I mean,
it was lovely. It was very rejuvenating, I thought.
It was, and it was a real validation of all the thinking that we've been doing over the last few months around scenario-based learning and how it unlocks people in learning environments. And it was good to just test it, because obviously we often work with adult learners, but to test it with a group of 12, 13-year-olds and to test out those dynamics, to test that you don't need much, to test the Kuleshov effect, to test that you can just do it with emails, with bits of paper, and to see what scenario-based learning can do for people, to move them to a point of learning and to keep energy in the room. So I think, it was good to test that, because it shows that scenario-based learning can work very hard to get you the kind of outcomes that you're after, but it's not often the thing that people will go to straight away because they think it's too complicated or too
Yeah,
crazy.
and of course, scenario-based learning can include. I mean, we forum theatre. We've worked with actors. We've made films. We've produced kind of audio-visual content that kind of launches scenarios. So and again, I would say even in those more elaborate expressions of scenario-based learning, all of the work as that was undertaken in advance of that was still around the idea of someone's cognitive budget, because if your scenario is very elaborate and people cannot see themselves in it, or it is not accurate, or it's not aligned with anything, then it is just decorative, right? So scenarios should never be decorative. I think they can be, and by that I mean you can use humor and you can use all sorts of other storytelling techniques. At the end of the day, though, it's a device to drive learning, and if it's not driving the learning, then it may be that that your recipe is not quite right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think now the idea. I mean, I don't know. This is probably controversial because with learning, often people sort of learning and knowledge often lives with the idea of fact and sort of But I honestly believe. I've always believed it, but now I've sort of I've nailed my flag to the mast around the powers of fiction to produce the sort of richer experiences that the learning is nonetheless real. I think that no one would argue, for example, that if you read a novel or if you watch a film, for example, or anything, or a play, that as you're engaging with the stories of characters, or as the life lessons or the learnings are no less real for having been delivered through a fictional sort of framework. I think that's still a bit of a leap for some people because it feels like a confusion of fact. But again, it's all about the MacGuffin. It's about what is the learning that you're trying to produce. And I think if you're looking at that, and we've done a lot of work around this, haven't we, Tony? Around it's not our work; it's like out there, isn't it? Around knowledge that's not applied is kind of inert. So the application of knowledge. You see the application of knowledge in fiction all the time because you watch characters go through something, they learn, they grow, they fail, and that's all safe. It's de-risked because it's not happening to us. But nonetheless, the learnings are real. That's where I think the value lives, which is dealing with risk. Really, yeah.
Yeah, and just that just made me think really that there's a very widely cited theory called communities of practice, which talks about this idea that learning happens everywhere. A guy called Etienne Wenger came up with it, and it's interesting because part of the reason it was so successful was because it makes the case that we learn in communities and we learn in our family. As soon as we're born, we're learning, but it's not kind of, no one's designed that learning. It's like we're learning machines. So learning happens everywhere. And I think your point about fiction is really important because fiction's almost a MacGuffin, because fiction depicts reality. So the fact that I can see myself and I can imagine that situation in a fictional book or a film, I'm learning from it because I can see it. So the fact that fiction is talking about a situation, a scenario that I can imagine myself in, or I can imagine someone else being in, this is the idea that learning happens everywhere. It's not designed in the traditional sense of there's learning outcomes. It's a situation, it's a scenario, it's a film, it's an environment that I can imagine, and therefore I can extract information from that in a productive way. So I think again this idea of fiction as a learning device is fascinating because it's actually how we all learn through being in the world, and fiction is just a description of being in the world. So I think that really is the power of fiction to unlock the kind of learning behaviors that we want people to.
Well, I still remember if you said to me about it's that classic thing, isn't there, about I don't remember anything I did at school, but I remember how I felt about it. And one of the sessions I still remember. I can't remember in what class or for what reason, but it was the hot air balloon game, which is the game where it's the ethics game, where you all, I remember the teacher said, some of us had to stand up, and we had to stand in a basket, hot air balloon basket. We weren't really in a hot air balloon basket. We're standing in front of the blackboard. There was like 6 of us, and I think there was a doctor and a dustman and a lawyer and an actor. And the idea was is that as you know how that game works, is that this hot air balloon is losing height, and everyone's going to die. And the class had to decide who was going to be thrown out over the side. And and what was fascinating about that is that, of course, what ultimately happened in that room was this big ethical discussion about what we want from society and what we value. It was high level stuff. It was kind of, in that respect, it was problematic knowledge. It was a risky scenario. The thing I remember most, though, was that the scenario meant that you had to make a choice, and it wasn't a choice you'd ever have to make in life. But if you look at things like disaster movies, or you look at sort of fiction where the scenario is a bit larger than life, there's something about the larger than life part. There's something about and I use the word filmic to describe, or cinematic to describe, slightly larger than life. That means everybody is disinhibited. It's like it's not real, but it's real enough so people can start to throw people out of the hot air, and they can have the discussion. And I think the other thing about a lot of scenarios, my problem with a lot of scenarios where people do it, is like the scenario is kind of like, Janet and Jim buy some sweets. It's just like, I'm sorry, but if Janet and Jim were in a plane that was crashing and they had to make a decision around how many sweets, because then I would be on that. I would be there.
Invested, yeah.
I think so. Scenario-based learning is as old as the hills, because they know that if you're going to learn maths, you have to go stand outside a bus timetable. I remember my GCSEs, which is like, oh my, okay, I understand. There is nothing radical about applied knowledge being enacted by scenarios. I would, though, say that risk, like the suspension of disbelief, the ability to produce participation, the ability to sort of let people have a bit of lead character energy, the ability to sort of be imaginatively activated by a scenario. I think a lot of people don't leverage scenarios because they're not fictional enough. I mean, the whole idea that these 12-year-olds were suddenly in charge of a startup, and the startup, I mean, it was perfect because it was just cinematic enough to let everybody have a go. And I don't know what your views on that might be, but that's my thinking about scenarios. It's like, it's not just Janet and Jim have some sweets,
Yeah. No, it reminds me of our colleague Nicholas Houghton, who taught me a lot about teaching. Always tells this story around, when you're teaching, you get given a stage, and it's yours to throw it away. So, we could, as I said earlier, we could have walked into that and just talked for 3 hours and very quickly lost the energy. But that's the privilege of teaching anything. You get given the power to move people, and it's yours to throw away. And I think this is where deploying scenario really helps, because all the pressure's not on you to be entertaining for 3 hours, and to be honest, you can only be entertaining for a little bit of time before people get bored. So you kick it off, but the scenario then does all this heavy lifting. If it's a scenario that's aligned to where those people are, where those learners are, they can recognize themselves in it, that scenario will do a lot more moving than you can ever do as a teacher. I think.
I mean, the CEO, the imaginary CEO, was in that room and worked incredibly hard.
Exactly, yeah.
Because he was an antagonist, it meant that a lot of I'm telling you now that because he was an antagonist, I mean, not because he was a villain, but because he was kind of the boss, that those teams bonded over an imaginary CEO.
Yeah.
They pulled together. There was the them and us thing, which the scenario was absolutely, I think, leveraging and enacting in order to keep people absolutely on their A game. And again, that's a storytelling technique right there. That's basic stuff, but vibrant. It was all deployed vibrantly, with just enough kind of narrative sparkle to ensure that everybody was disinhibited enough to enjoy, and there was loads of role play going on, but the dreaded word was never used.
No.
He never said role play. In fact, role play probably you should be banned because of the effect that it has on people.
Yeah, produces an effect.
It's just terrible.
Yeah. All right, so finish with a shameless plug. So we pulled together some of our thoughts in a little white paper. We've done a lot of work recently around employability, as we've said, and how scenario-based learning can unlock some insights around employability. So If you'd like to find out more about that, then just go to ding.global and sign up, and you can download the white paper, which is Beyond Content, How Scenario-Based Learning Delivers Employability in the Age of AI. And there we've just pulled together all of our thoughts and advice and a good case study around how you can start to leverage and deploy scenario-based learning to unlock employability in your courses or your programs. So I hope that's useful. Phil, thank you for taking the time for a deep dive. And again, just thanks for producing such a fantastic scenario for India. It was an absolute pleasure to run it. And like you say, that was just 3 hours of absolute magic.
Yeah, and I just want to say that because learning design, or designing for learning, sometimes, like all things, all disciplines that are sort of slightly adjacent, it can sometimes people feel, well, how do you know it works? And, you end up in that slight strange space where people say, oh yeah, well, that's just best practice, or, yeah, but I'm at the coal face, or all of those things. And I just would play that back, which is that my view, and I know it's shared by you, Tony, that our job, however consultative and however sort of adjacent, or whether we're in the middle delivering a workshop or designing a workshop or thinking about how a workshop could be better, whatever it is that we are always interested in producing the energy in the room that we saw, because anything less than that, is sort of like a conga. It's just kind of people turn up, nothing happens, and so yeah, our ambition for Ding and our reason for working together is to move the needle and to create learning experiences that are memorable, not because I don't know, because they had a virtual reality headsets necessarily, but because something happened and people felt something move. And so for me, it was this whole experience was a return to the sort of the origin story of the company, really, in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And just a reminder that you don't need loads of tech to produce a great learning experience.
Yeah.
So thanks all. If you'd like to find out more, have a look at ding.global and check out the blog where you can see previous recordings of our entertaining webinars. Well, hopefully they're entertaining. And yes, just and
we should do one where we throw people out of a hot air balloon.
We should, yeah. I mean, that's tune in next week for the next webinar.